Okay.
So welcome, and I'm going to introduce myself as Chris Morin, and I am the Director of Prevention, Education, and Outreach at Independence House, and we are partnering with CORD, the organization CORD, in this prevention of sexual violence with people with disabilities, in particular intellectual and developmental disabilities. And I'm going to just introduce you to my partner, Meryl, from CORD.
Hi, I'm Meryl. I'm the Rape Prevention and Education Coordinator for CORD, and we've been working with Independence House on this project for almost a year now.
Yeah, right. Yeah, so we want to make an overall statement about the information on this in the training. Might be, it's a very emotional at some points, might make people uncomfortable or trigger something. So we want you to take care of yourselves and do whatever you need to do to meet your needs. Okay, so why don't we begin?
All right. So this presentation, as Chris mentioned, is about sexual violence and people with disabilities, and we're going to discuss how to understand it, respond to it, and prevent it. This is our information about our two agencies, Independence House and CORD. We're going to start by talking about understanding and responding to sexual violence among people with disabilities. So when we think about sexual violence in general, a lot of the time people just think of words like rape or they think about sexual assault, but it's really so much broader than that. So I always like to just take a moment to highlight what a large issue sexual violence really is. It can include cyber harassment, voyeurism, stalking, just degrading sexual imagery. There are just so many forms of sexual violence. So when we're talking today and any other day about sexual violence, we're thinking about all of these terms, and it makes us really see how prevalent it is. When we're looking at the general population, not just people with disabilities, we know that more than 1 in 3 women experience sexual violence involving physical contact during her lifetime. So that's not including all of those other areas of sexual violence. It's just including sexual violence that involved physical contact. Nearly 1 in 4 men involve the same type of sexual, have an experience of the same type of sexual violence in their lifetime. And then the estimated cost of rape is $122,461 per victim. That might seem like a really high number, but when we think about the cost of, if say they choose to press charges, they're going through the justice system, that might be costly. All of the medical treatment they might need, the therapy that they might need, all of those costs really add up. Some of those costs are something that the victim has to pay themselves, and some of those costs are put on our entire population. It's something that our government needs to fund some more services for. As a society, we're paying more and more for it. So that's why this is an issue that really pertains to all of us, not just victims. Now, not just looking at the general population, but when we narrow in on people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, we know that these people are experiencing sexual violence at 7 times the rate of the general population. People with intellectual and developmental disabilities are more vulnerable than the general population, so they're more targeted. We know that if someone's a woman and has an intellectual or developmental disability, they're 12 times more likely to be sexually abused. And we know that for this population, the abuse is repeated. Most survivors with intellectual and developmental disabilities are assaulted multiple times in their life, and half of those survivors will be assaulted more than 10 times in their lifetime. This is strikingly different when you're comparing it to neurotypical populations. And not most, but a lot of these attacks are occurring during the day, 40%. And that shows that this is a community that's vulnerable 24/7. It's not just dark alleyways in the middle of the night where there's risk. These are people that are being attacked in broad daylight. And even though this is specifically talking about intellectual and developmental disabilities, we know that people with any disability are also facing higher rates of assault. We just don't have the studies with the exact numbers right now. We're lucky that NPR did a series called Abused and Betrayed, and they were able to get these numbers from the Justice Department. So we actually finally have some accurate data for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. Now, it's estimated that only 3% of sexual abuse of people with developmental disabilities is reported, and that's compared to 23% of the general population. That's a huge difference. We know that anybody who has been sexually violated, it's very hard to come forward for a lot of reasons, and we'll get more into that. But it's even harder for people with disabilities. They have so many more barriers when it comes to communication and even just being believed. So reporting is really low. And that's something that we, as parents of people with disabilities and as people who work with people with disabilities, have to be really mindful of, is that it's very possible that there are people we know that have had something happen to them and they haven't reported it. It's important to think about the fact that sexual violence often starts early in the lifespan. And this isn't specific to people with disabilities, but it absolutely applies to everybody. Among women reporting a history of completed rape, 40% first experienced it before they were 18. More than 28% indicated that they were first raped between 11 and 17. And among men, that number is 21%. They were first experienced sexual violence before they were 18. So we know that even if the population that we're working with is adults, for example, this is still relevant because we know that those reporting rates are really low. So there's a good chance that somebody that we're working with has experienced this in their childhood and not shared it with anybody. So we have to really factor in that history of trauma and how that might be impacting their behavior and their relationships, and how it might make them vulnerable for more sexual violence in the future. It's also why it's so important that we give our kids opportunities to share when they're young, because if someone is violated when they're very young and it's addressed and they're able to talk about it and get help for it, then the repercussions are much less, and they're much less likely to be abused again later in life. So we don't need to know about neuropsychology in order to prevent sexual abuse or understand it, but it can be helpful for us to just have a basic understanding about how the brain works when it experiences trauma, because it helps us to empathize with people who have gone through it. We know that a lot of people aren't believed because they experience gaps in memory. We see it all the time, especially when you see a trial on the news. People talk about, well, the story didn't match up, or she told this story one time and then she told this story another time. And this is actually a completely normal response to trauma. So when someone goes through something traumatic like sexual violence, their brain has been designed, or their nervous system has been designed to either fight, freeze, flee, or fawn. So fight is like those instances where you see something traumatic happen and the person they start throwing punches, they're defending themselves. Freeze is like a deer in headlights, like they're just suddenly frozen, they can't move. Fleeing is exactly what it sounds like, it's just running away. And fawn is a little bit different in that if you've heard the term Stockholm Syndrome, it can be kind of similar to that, where a person's brain twists what happened to them to make it into something that they can accept, that's something that doesn't feel as traumatic. So if somebody does something sexual and there's no consent involved, the victim might twist it and say, okay, well, you know, maybe it was my fault that he did that. Maybe I should have done something different. you know, maybe he wants to be my boyfriend and I should be really grateful for that. And maybe I'll just be his girlfriend and it's fine. So fawning is when things get flipped and the victim starts attaching themselves to the perpetrator. During sexual assault, a person's prefrontal cortex is impaired and that fear circuitry takes over. So that's when that freeze, flee, fawn, fight, all of that kicks in. So then when that fear circuitry goes away and goes back to working normally, your prefrontal cortex, the main part of your brain that's thinking, comes back into play. And it wasn't really present. It kind of went on vacation while that trauma was happening. And now it's back and it doesn't really know what happened to you. So then when somebody comes, an investigator, a lawyer, whoever comes and says, well, what happened to you? That part of your brain that is responding to them wasn't really there. So it makes it very hard to remember things. So now if you take that and you add in cognitive disabilities and already existing barriers to communication, it makes it close to impossible to report what happened because you're having trouble just communicating what's going on in general. And then you add in all of these gaps in memory that are totally normal and just their brain working normally. And that's why we're seeing such low reporting rates. And it's something to keep in mind because a lot of people with disabilities aren't believed when they come forward, and it's for these reasons most of the time. So
Here,
perpetrators.
Excuse me, Meryl.
Yes.
I wonder if, because it's not face-to-face, if anyone had a question up at this point. Anybody? I know we have a new person joined us. Welcome. Okay. If anyone has a question, you can put it in at the bottom. There's a chat, and you can ask the question in the chat. Okay. All right.
Thank you.
Sorry. Thanks, Meryl.
All right, no problem. I'm going to pull up the chat just so I can make sure I see it. So predators, we know, target vulnerabilities. Often caregivers have a role that gives them power. And this doesn't mean that we're saying that every caregiver is a perpetrator, because that's not true at all. We know that. But an abuser, somebody with an abusive personality and abusive behavior could take on the role of a caregiver in order to access people who are vulnerable. So that's something we have to be mindful of. Those who are sexually violent can be acquaintances, family members, trusted individuals, caregivers, or strangers. We actually know that statistically, they're probably not a stranger. They're probably somebody that we know. They often get away with repeated abuse because, like we said, these crimes go unreported and unrecognized and often unpunished. Oh, did it go? Did it skip ahead? There we go. So I just wanted to take a minute to look at these quotes of people who are survivors of sexual assault who have intellectual disabilities. People look at people with disability as, a lot of the time, they look at us thinking that we don't know better because a lot of us is quiet and easygoing. They think that we're weakling and we're not. It happens to people like us, and why is because we're easy targets to take advantage of. We think that the people that we're around, we can trust them, but you don't know that by looking at them. You can't judge a person by their looks. And I like for us to be able to take a moment to just hear the words of people who have actually gone through this and how they feel. And it's really unfortunate that they feel that people look at them differently, that they look at them as weak, when they're really, in fact, very strong. The risks of compliancy. So compliancy culture is a culture where people with disabilities don't have a lot of choice in their day-to-day life. Nobody sets out in a job to create an environment that is going to cause sexual abuse to be more likely to happen. When a staff person at an agency or a director or anyone really that's working with people with disabilities starts making decisions for people instead of with people, it's not because they're trying to take choice away from the individuals. They're just trying to make their jobs easier. I think we all want our jobs to be easier and efficient. And sometimes, for example, if you're in a group home and everybody wants something different for breakfast, that can be really time consuming. Or maybe one individual takes a really long time to decide what they want for breakfast, or they take a really long time to get themselves dressed, even though it's something that they would like to be able to do. So then staff might feel inclined to make those decisions for them. But the problem is, when we take choice away from someone, we create reliance on others for support, and that makes people more vulnerable. It also can be really difficult, say with bathing, because it makes it really difficult to distinguish boundaries. Say somebody is in a group home and they're introduced to a new staff person that's just started, and that staff person is going to be helping them with some intimate care, maybe in the bath. So they're told, this person that you've never met before is going to touch you in very private places, but that's okay because they're just helping you. They're cleaning you. It's okay. They're a helper. They're a good person. But that can make it really tricky to distinguish if later on that person comes to them and does something really inappropriate. It can be hard to think about how they were able to touch them earlier and it was okay, but now it's not okay. So typically it'll happen that somebody will think, well, the touch in the shower was okay, so this touch might be okay too. So it's for reasons like that that we want to make sure that we're giving people as much choice as possible. And so for parents, I always recommend that when you're looking at different providers, you ask a lot of questions about how much choice the individuals actually have in their day-to-day. And a lot of agencies do this. A lot of agencies really recognize and support choice, and that's wonderful. But as parents, it's just important that we're asking those important questions. And that we're also, when we meet staff at agencies that are working with our kids, that we ask them questions too, because maybe the agency is all about choice, but maybe a particular staff person isn't fully on board with that. So it's important to find out how much choice the individuals have in their day-to-day, whether it's what breakfast they're eating or how much they're able to make decisions when it comes to personal care. And a lot of people do need intimate care, so there's not really an easy solution, but you can give choices. You can say, are you comfortable with this person helping you with this? Do you want me to wash your back and you can wash your private area? You can ask questions like that and give them as much choice as possible. Things to watch out for, or if you notice with an agency or anyone working with individuals that it's expected that they follow directions of caregivers without saying no. If no is not readily accepted or encouraged, that's a warning sign. And it's just important to remember that all of this creates a culture that causes people to have a harder time identifying risky situations and avoiding them. So signs of sexual abuse or violence. There can be a lot of different signs, but the thing that I really want to highlight is that any behavior that is different from a person's baseline is a red flag. So maybe you'll see an injury of unknown origin, maybe you'll see changes in mood or behavior, avoidance of activities. An example of subtle signs might just be that someone says, I hate Wednesdays. And that's all they say. They don't go further than that. I just hate Wednesdays. And you might just think, okay, well, you know, I hate Mondays, so what's the big deal? But it's worth asking more questions and trying to dig a little deeper, because maybe they hate Wednesdays because they're going to a specific program and they just don't like the program. They just don't like the activities that they're doing. Maybe they think it's boring and that's it. But maybe they hate Wednesdays because they're going to a specific program and there's a staff person that they have an issue with. Now, maybe they just don't mesh with that staff person, but maybe something else is going on. So it's just worth asking more questions, because it's possible with some people that saying, I hate Wednesdays, is their way of communicating that something is happening. But again, any behavior that's different from baseline, if you see changes in someone, then it means that something is going on. It doesn't mean it's sexual abuse, but it's something that should be looked into. Oh. So there are always barriers to identifying abuse. It's possible that disability-related traits may overlap signs of sexual assault. If we have someone who's self-injuring, then that can make it tricky to recognize injuries that they've done to themselves or injuries that somebody else might have done to them. Someone might have a fear of not having their needs met. Maybe they have someone who's helping them out in a certain area of their life who's possibly even threatening and saying, well, what would you do without me? You need me to take care of you. And they're afraid that if they say something and this person gets in trouble, then they won't have those needs met anymore. They may be struggling with communicating, and they may be trying to communicate in ways like that I hate Wednesdays thing, but it's not being heard. And sometimes signs of abuse are just interpreted as behavioral problems. They're seen as, this person's just going through a rough time, they're having a bad week. But that's why it's so important that we obtain a behavioral baseline, and especially as parents, we know when something's different with our kids. We know what their behavioral baseline is. So when there's a shift in that, it's important to look into, why is there a shift? Is it a minor thing that's upsetting them and causing a shift in behavior, or is there something more going on? We've talked a lot about the barriers to coming forward and why people don't come forward. But overall, these are just more reasons. There's fear of judgment, there's fear of not being believed, and this can really apply to anybody. There's fear of re-traumatization. It can be really, really hard to have to relive something horrible that's happened to you. And a lot of the time, coming forward involves doing a lot of that. You might have to relive it by telling a parent or a caregiver, and then retell it to the police, and then retell it to a lawyer and a judge and a jury. And that's a lot of re-traumatization, and some people don't feel up to going through that. Some people might not understand what's happened to them and that it's bad, and some people might not be able to communicate what's happened. So there are a lot of reasons why people don't come forward. So you suspect abuse, what do you do next? If someone comes to you, whether it's your child or someone you're working with or anyone, it's important to be very validating and listen. And some things that you can say, because often it's a difficult situation and we might kind of freeze and not know what to say. So these are some suggestions. You can say, I believe you. I'm sorry this happened to you. You're not alone. It took a lot of courage for you to tell me about this. This shouldn't have happened to you. It's not your fault. You didn't do anything to deserve this. Things like that are very empathetic and compassionate. The core values that we want to remember when we're responding to a disclosure are that we want to show our child that we care. We want to help them regain choice. We want to respect their privacy. And we want to give back what their abuser took away, which is power, safety, and choice. When someone discloses to you, you'll want to stay calm, avoid judgment, be supportive and validating, listen, don't ask too many questions, because they'll share with you what they're able to share with you and what they're ready to share with you. It's important to know your resources and get in touch with any services that you think would be helpful, and discuss SANE if applicable, and I'll explain what SANE is now. So a SANE exam is a forensic exam that when somebody is sexually assaulted, they're able to get this exam at the hospital, and Cape Cod Hospital has a SANE nurse that provides this, and so does Falmouth Hospital. And it's part of the Massachusetts Sexual Assault Nurse Examiner Program, which is what SANE stands for. And during this exam, a person will have an advocate with them from Independence House. They'll have a SANE nurse, and if they would like, they can also have a police officer there. And what will happen is that the nurse will take samples, and then those will be saved for evidence in case the victim decides to prosecute. The criteria for having a SANE exam is that the assault should have happened within 5 days, unless it was oral or anal penetration, then it needs to be within 24 hours. A SANE exam that's done through Cape Cod Hospital or Falmouth Hospital through this program, in that case, the patient needs to be 12 or older. The patient needs to be medically cleared by the ER physician, which is just part of the process when you go into the hospital. And the patient needs to consent to the exam and to evidence collection. Now, if this is a child under the age of 12, they're able to go through Children's Cove, which I believe is in Yarmouth. And Children's Cove is able to do exams for children. So I just want to circle back to the importance of empowering people who have survived a sexual assault. In order to empower somebody, we need to make sure we're respecting their confidentiality and not, gossiping and sharing everything that we're hearing from them with others. We want to believe and validate their experiences. It's very hard to come forward, and if you don't feel believed, then you might be unlikely to come forward again. We want to acknowledge the injustice that's happened to them. We want to respect their autonomy, especially as parents. I feel like we just get into go mode, and when something happens to our child, like, we want to fix it and we want to make it okay. But it's important to give them a lot of choice in this, because when something like this has happened to them, it's taken their autonomy away, and the way to rebuild that is to give them a lot of choice and power in how we heal together. We want to help them plan for future safety so this type of thing doesn't happen again. And we want to promote access to community services like counseling and any type of support they might need. So there are a lot of different barriers to not just coming forward, but there can be barriers to believing someone and coping with someone disclosing to you. So sometimes we'll hear people say things like, I can't believe that they would do a thing like that. There must be some mistake. But it's important to remember that people are complicated. You cannot know for certain what others are capable of doing. This is the type of thing that you see on the news all the time. It's those neighbors that are saying, I can't believe my neighbor was capable of this. I can't believe they committed this crime. Because we only see certain sides of people, and so it's difficult for us to judge a person based on what we know, because people are very complex and they can be capable of doing things that we would never assume they could do. I don't want to get someone in trouble. It's important to remember that we aren't getting someone in trouble by calling the police, reporting to the appropriate agency, or doing whatever we need to do. The person who committed the crime or perpetrated, that's the person who's accountable for getting in trouble. They are responsible for their own behavior, and we aren't. We might even hear someone say, I'm not certain there even was a sexual assault. And it's just good to remember that it's better to be wrong than to not acknowledge a sexual assault and add to the emotional trauma that a person is going through. What about false reporting? We hear about false reporting all the time. False reports, depending on what study you're looking at, make up about 2 to 10% of sexual violence disclosures. And this is very similar to any other crime. A lot of people think that sexual violence has more false reporting, but it actually doesn't. This is the same number that you would see for burglaries, arson, any violent crime. And this what's a little bit unique about sexual violence is that this does not factor in an insanely large number of sexual assaults that go unreported. We know that the majority of sexual assaults are not reported, so that really skews the data that we have. So we know that false reports are actually probably much, much less frequent than the data suggests. There are many barriers to disclosure. So if someone discloses and is not believed, they will be unlikely to disclose again. And that's why it's so important not to assume that something is a false report, because statistically it probably isn't. And even if it is, it's better to risk that than re-traumatize somebody further by not believing them and having them have to hold this to themselves. So here are just some important referrals to make, or places that you might want to contact if this is ever something that you're dealing with. Independence House, where Chris is from, does counseling services. They have support groups. They have some family law. CORD, where I'm from, we do a lot of systems advocacy, and pretty much any type of advocacy related to disability. If you can think of it, we do it. So we're a good place to contact for that. The Barnstable District and probate courts have Safe Plan offices in all of them, and Safe Plan is a program run by Independence House that will help people obtain restraining orders and will also give advice around whether or not a restraining order is something that would be useful. They're very helpful when it comes to safety planning. SANE, we talked about already. The Victim Rights Law Center is a legal resource for survivors. Children's Cove, we talked about, is they can be similar to SANE and do the children's exams, but they also have counseling services for child survivors. And then DPPC is the Disabled Persons Protection Committee, and they have the SARU unit, which stands for Sexual Assault Response Unit. And that's a group of people that are able to navigate resources for somebody with a disability after they've been sexually assaulted, and they can set them up with a peer support specialist. So they have people with intellectual disabilities on their staff who are survivors and have been sexually assaulted, and those people can talk with survivors and help them out and just be a wonderful support for them. So before we go into prevention, are there any questions? Chris, do you want to share from yours?
Yes.
Perfect.
Share screen. What am I doing here? Sorry.
It's okay.
Okay, I'm going to, sorry, I'm going to skip quickly down. So part of the work that we're doing, I guess maybe I could explain a little bit. I'm sorry about this. I meant to have it lined up.
Do you want me to? I can click through because I already have it up. You want me to just do that?
All right. Thanks.
No problem.
So the work that CORD and Independence House are doing as a partner is really looking at how can we prevent sexual violence, in particular with people with intellectual disabilities, as has been explained, one of the most vulnerable populations. And so a lot of the work that's done in the field is with individual, training people about healthy relationships and healthy sexuality. What are the red flags? What do I do? And that's really important. And then, but the work that we are building up to is also looking at how communities and in organizations and anyone in a community, including parents, be part of that prevention. So, okay, go ahead. So many people's feelings, I've been doing this work about 8 years at Independence House, and so prevention is a very big, my passion. And we live in a very violent culture, you know, just in general. And so a lot of people really feel like domestic and sexual violence will always happen, so we just need to deal with it. But our work is really in the primary prevention, where it just never takes taking action before violence even occurs. And that seems like a very big pipe dream to a lot of people. But it doesn't take one strategy to do this, it takes many. Okay. And so we're talking about primary prevention, and we have two other terms that we use: secondary prevention, which is doing activities that would decrease somebody's risk at being sexually assaulted. One example is self-defense classes, going to the courts and getting things in place for safety plan. And the other one, the next one, is tertiary prevention, which is addressing and reducing the long-term consequences of sexual violence, which would be the counseling and the support groups, which is what many agencies have, very common. Okay, so we have those three levels, and one of the things that's really important when we're looking at prevention is to look at the risk factors. What are things in place in our culture that are risky, that make it possible for people to violate somebody else? And then what are the protective factors? Of course, in our work, we want to increase the protective factors and lessen the the risk factors. So those are terms that you might hear throughout, just in this work that we're doing. So, and again, this is in general, it's for all people in a population, including people with disabilities. But so people who are exposed to violence at home, they might be involved in any kind of delinquent behavior. Many people who are abused they have lost control, and so they do things that aren't necessarily healthy, but it gives them control. So in delinquent behavior, by using excessive alcohol, might be robbing a store or whatever, but these are the risk factors, right? The social norms that we have that support sexual violence. Look at all the jokes on TV and the jokes that people say and the comments that people make. It's kind of a social norm to kind of laugh at those women jokes or dumb blonde jokes, that kind of thing. So part of this work in looking at prevention is really addressing social norms, and that's not an easy task, but it's part of the work that we try to do. And then we have weak laws and policies related to sexual violence. We see in the paper all the time how, and the statistics that Meryl has shared, that very few people who sexually violate somebody actually go to jail or go to court, because survivors aren't believed, and especially around people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And then again, going back to what Meryl has presented, compliancy, especially in a culture of young people or people with intellectual or developmental disabilities, it helps us get things done. So helping people to make those choices is really important. And then on the protective side, of course, family is the biggest support system people have. Do we provide people with empowering role models, respectful relationships? And we know that men are abused in many ways, but we also know our culture supports men's behaviors, just referring back to the jokes, or men taking charge all the time, putting women down. So we want to present nurturing male role models, people who respect everybody. And then the really big piece of protective factors, when people And families even and organizations have policies that support those who disclose sexual violence, that we don't deny it, we don't put it under the rug. And so part of our work, as this training here is kind of a stepping stone in working with Kennedy Donovan, but we'll be looking at talking to the organizations that we're working with to look at their policies and just kind of tweak them and say, do we have a policy that says if somebody discloses, what do I do? What's the process? Who do I go to? And so in that way, when somebody discloses, they know that they have support. And so that is a very big protective factor. And it's something that I think all of our agencies, anybody that needs to really look at those. So those are some of the things we'll be working on. And so these next several slides are taken from the Enough Abuse campaign, which is a campaign that came out of the Massachusetts MassKids.org, which is the child's advocacy agency for Massachusetts. And they created this campaign to educate community members, in particular parents, about what they could do, what we all could do as members of a community to prevent sexual violence. So as Meryl has alluded to, this information is really for anybody. It's we have children, we have adult children, and so and we emphasize it here because the population that we are talking about now is at the most vulnerable. And so we want to educate ourselves on recognizing those signs. And again, Meryl has alluded to this, and so this is just kind of emphasizing it, that we want to recognize those signs that suggest somebody might pose a risk to our sons or daughters. So there's many, many tactics that high-risk abusers use, and most often they are one of the most socially adept and likable and nice people. The niceness is not a personality trait, it's a calculated decision. So you have somebody, of course, they're never going to become close to anybody if they're not nice. And they can be patient and build trust over time before they actually abuse, because that is the way they work, right? They have to build a trust with the family member or the coach or whoever their child is with, and then they feel comfortable asking if I can take a person on a trip with me, if I can go to the park with them. And they might select jobs that are legitimate access to children, so they can be looking at their potential victims. Now I say this, and again, this is not meant to put fear in people about friends of theirs. It is meant to, child sexual abuse and abuse of anybody is very, very big epidemic. And so if we are more alert about just paying attention to some red flags, this is one of the strategies to address sexual assault. Okay, and then some more tactics. That they might befriend children or adults with physical, developmental, behavioral disabilities, believing them to be less likely to disclose abuse or to be believed. And they may build a person's attachment and dependency on them through gifts and money and special treats. And we see that very often in the work that Independence does. Children and people with intellectual and developmental disabilities have a capacity to be very vulnerable and wanting to please. And so gifts and money and special treats are things they might not want to give up. That's just one of the tactics. So behavioral signs of adults that might be abusing is that they ignore verbal and physical cues, that people don't want to be touched. The child doesn't want to be touched. They have a different special friend with a disability from year to year. They give money or gifts for no particular occasion. And so these are red flags. And if something is repetitive, this is something you want to look in. Okay. So how do we reduce these opportunities for sexual abuse? I think more and more parents are doing this, but we want to plan activities that involve several children and adults together. You want to eliminate the one-on-one situation. And if that's has to happen for some reason, you want to ask how time went. How was it spent? You know, did you have a good time? What was their reaction? You want to ask anyone working with your son or daughter about their safety policies. Be vigilant without conveying fear. I had this example of a friend of mine who, I think sometimes we don't want to step out of that box by like say, what are your safety policies? It's something that maybe isn't done a lot and we're not comfortable with it. But this friend of mine was very vigilant. She had 5 children and very close in age, teenagers. And one night, one day her daughter came home going to a graduation party. It was a co-ed party and it was a sleepover. And she asked her mother if she could go. And the mom said, absolutely not. You know, she didn't know the supervision. She just didn't want to create any red flags, let's say, right? And so she was really always outspoken. And so the daughter said to her, well, you need to give me an answer because all the other parents want to know what you have to say. So she said they could go to the party and she would pick her up at midnight. And when she got there, there was this line of cars waiting to pick up their child at midnight. And so I think that I remember myself growing up, my children are adults now, but I never questioned anybody. When I sent my kids, I trusted. And I never questioned anybody somebody new in my child's life if I knew them from school. And nothing did happen, but it would have been better for me to be a little bit more vigilant and just check out where my child's going. You want to establish body safety and privacy rules in your family. We'll talk about that a little bit. And then educate your son and daughter about their body and healthy sexuality. Again, talking about sexuality is not always comfortable for people, but we really need to be able to do that in a very comfortable way. Okay, let's go on to the next. So we want to encourage communication and discourage secrecy. As you can see, secrecy and keeping everything quiet is what keeps this sexual violence going. So we want to be thinking broader than behavioral signs. That, of course, is a red flag. And as Meryl has said, it's not necessarily mean something, but it's worth digging deeper. But we want to use efforts to tell are often indirect and embedded in dialogue, especially with teens. They might look to others to help them understand the world and what's happening to them. So we want to take effort to tell are often indirect and embedded in dialogue. They often need an occasion or an opportunity in order to tell. We'll be mentioning that in a little bit. And parents can improve their sensitivity to these verbal cues and understand the meaning behind them. We know that, or I know in particular, that teens talk in code sometimes, or don't want to say everything. But when there's something a little off, we need to be able to see that and respond to it in some way. Okay, what's next here? So we have a few scenarios. Uncle Jim calls to say he's coming over to pick up Jake and take him to the mall. Jake is unhappy about the news and wants someone else to take him to the mall. A second scenario is Mr. Smith's wife will be in the hospital for several weeks, and a neighbor, Steve, and his daughter offer to come by a few times a week to help him with household chores. Later, Steve reminds Anne to go over there again to help out, and Anne is upset. So those are 2 scenarios, and 2 responses. Do I have to go with Uncle Joe to the mall? Do I really have to go to see Mr. Smith? So that's kind of like questioning what's been asked of them. And then there's might be challenging, right? Why can't we all go to the mall as a family? And why can't he just hire someone else to do his house cleaning? So those are questions. They're challenging, and a teenager challenges a lot, right? But you need to, what we need to listen to and find out maybe what's the matter. So a response by a parent could be, Uncle Joe likes to do things with you. Why don't you want to? We don't want to disappoint him. And Mr. Smith expects you. You can't break your promise to help. Those might be natural answers to the question, right? But could we ask in a different way? Why do you like Uncle Joe? Why don't you want to go with him? What about going over to Mrs. Smith that you don't like? It's a difference there, right? We're pursuing their questions, and they might have totally answers that have nothing to do with their uncomfortableness or disclosing anything. But we want to be able to hear the question in their voice and ask them further. If that makes sense to everybody. So here are some scenarios where you have an occasion that presents itself and relates to private body parts. A father and son are watching a TV crime show, and the son asks, what do they call what that guy did? The dad said, that's called rape. And the son discloses, oh, that's what the neighbor's doing to me. So that is a perfect disclosure. And I think we'll go into a little bit, and Meryl has also mentioned it. That is a perfect disclosure, and we need to respond to that. So the next one is mother helps her daughter bathe before bedtime. The daughter's been diagnosed for the 4th time with urinary tract infection. And the mother tells the daughter, the doctor says that nasty infection is back again. The daughter says, well, maybe his fingers were dirty. Again, it might be a shocking answer, but that is this person's disclosing. So what do we do? So we want to have regular conversations about personal space. We want to encourage them to talk as free as they can, be independent and autonomous in their personal care, and emphasize their right to choice. Introduce the concepts of okay touch and not okay, and teach their sons and daughters to respect others' privacy. And so in the disclosures that we just mentioned, these are things that we want to have already done, and so that them disclosing, they feel comfortable. And that's basically what it is. They want them to feel comfortable to say that something happened. Without the television program, they might not have been able to. They might not have been able to express that. But any source of social media or anything that you have an opportunity to talk about different things, we should take it. Okay. So we've alluded to this, but we want to teach about body safety rules. What are the correct names for our private parts? Penis, vagina, breast, and buttocks. And so to tell children, grown-ups and older children have no business touching or playing with a child's private parts. And adults, no one should touch or play with your private parts unless you want them to. Again, we're talking about adults with intellectual or developmental disabilities. It's important not to cross another person's body boundaries and touch their private parts. And so it's up to you to decide what's the best way to talk about private parts and give them proper names and not be embarrassed by it, so that the child or the adult child is not embarrassed by it. Another training I went to talked about a little girl talking to her mother about not liking to play with Johnny anymore because Johnny puts his stick in my pocketbook. And the mother had no idea what that meant. And she just said, well, stop telling him to put his stick in your pocketbook. Well, he was putting his penis in her vagina. And so if those words were made available and felt comfortable saying, the mother would have acted quickly. Okay, so that's why it's really important to be open with this kind of language. So the other difficult thing is, how do we communicate with somebody that we're concerned about their sexual behavior? As has been stated, most abuse and sexual violence occurs with somebody the person knows. And we're talking about violating a child or a person, an adult child with intellectual or developmental disabilities. There's the vulnerability there that they will not be able to express anything. So the other part of giving our children the right information, the right conversations, and feeling comfortable with it is watching out for the adults that they're with. And again, most people that we know do not do this, but this is education. Knowledge is power. And so let's talk about how to talk to somebody, right? So if you're concerned about someone's sexual behavior, we want you to trust your instincts. Write down what you have observed. Reach out. You don't have to handle this on your own. You can call DCF or DPPC if you have questions. Many times we're mandated reporters, and so when I have called DCF over, I had a question because they've already been reported, but they're very good about, you can just ask them, and is this reportable? They'll help you through that. Immediately report any suspected abuse of a child or person under 18 or with a disability. Okay, what do we have next? So we want to increase our community responsibility for prevention. We want to educate ourselves, such as this kind of a training about sexual abuse and how to prevent it. And we want to communicate what we learn to educate our children and other people around us. I had gave one of these presentations to a volunteers for faith community who are working with children. And after the training, one of the people contacted me, and because she wanted to give me a follow-up. So she had spoken with her sister who lived in Colorado, and the sister had said that her son had come home from camp and brought a note from the counselor that said, I'd like to stay in touch with your son, basically. And so that's a red flag, right? And the person that attended the training said, well, you need to follow up with that. That's really not appropriate. And so she took, it took about 3 phone calls for the sister to follow up. And she called the director, explained what happened, had the letter, and the director said, absolutely not, that's inappropriate, you're crossing boundaries. And so the purpose of this kind of information is that we don't know what that young man's counselor man was, what his intentions were. They may have been totally just wanted to be a buddy, right? But it was a red flag, and he was crossing boundaries. And we don't know if sexual assault was prevented, but we do know it was prevented because of just following up. It was a red flag. And so I know that in some situations, what's been disclosed to me, somebody has questioned a coach, right? And so in that kind of a case, you might be, this is a coach that you know, he's coached for years, and as has been said, it would be very difficult to think that he would actually abuse somebody. I'll just refer to the news articles in the past about different coaches nationally who have been abusing, like gymnasts for 20 years. So, and what you do, what to do in that case is to, as I said, maybe take some notes, but be on alert for what your child is saying. Be on alert. Be more due diligence about, just going to those the practices and the meetings. But if your child is saying something is happening, then you obviously need to follow up. But if there are some red flags, you can be vigilant to follow up with that, and maybe just ask him, what does he do when he is taking my daughter on a trip? We really do have to be a little bit more forceful when being concerned about somebody's adult's sexual behavior. Okay, so I think that brings us to the end.